I introduce today's keynote speaker for the 10th anniversary conference of the Journal of West African History. Few scholars have had as transformative an impact on the study of African history, the African diaspora, and global scholarship on race, culture, and identity as Dr. Michael A. Gomez. His extraordinary career has not only redefined our understanding of West Africa and its people, but has also fundamentally reshaped how we view the African diaspora as a dynamic and integral force in world history. Dr. Gomez is currently the Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. He was the visionary founder of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, ASWAD, which has become a vibrant global network of scholars and thinkers across continents. His leadership as series editor for Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora has further elevated the platform for critical scholarship, allowing cutting-edge research to flourish in our field. His intellectual contributions are nothing short of monumental. From his pioneering work, Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, which illuminated the complexities of Muslim polities in pre-colonial West Africa, to Exchanging Our Country Marks, which provided groundbreaking insights into the transformation of African identities in the Americas, Dr. Gomez has carved an indelible path. His magnum opus, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, offers an unparalleled exploration of the interwoven tapestries of polity, religion, and power during one of West Africa's most iconic eras. He has ventured into the realms that were previously underexplored, providing not only historical analysis, but also a humanistic recentering of African voices in global narratives. Yet, Dr. Gomez's influence extends beyond the written word. His work with UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project and his enduring commitment to preserving and advancing Arabic manuscript projects in Mali highlight his dedication to not just understanding African history, but safeguarding its legacy for future generations. His scholarship serves as a bridge, linking us to a deeper appreciation of the struggles, triumphs, and enduring spirit of people of African descent worldwide. Today, Dr. Gomez graces us with a keynote presentation entitled Political Space in West Africa, Interplay of Innovation and Integrity Over Time. He will guide us through centuries of political evolution in West Africa, from the 8th century CE to the dawn of colonialism, exploring how West African communities have continuously fashioned, innovated, and nuanced political systems that balance indigenous values with ideas from far-reaching influences. These systems, complex and kaleidoscopic, have yet to be fully appreciated within the often limiting categories of Western analysis. Dr. Gomez will challenge us to think deeply about whether our scholarship has done justice to the intricate and sophisticated political logics of Western Africa. It is rare to encounter a scholar whose work both elevates the past and illuminates our understanding of the present. We are in the presence of such an individual today. It is therefore with deep admiration and great anticipation that I ask you to join me in welcoming one of the foremost intellectual giants of our time and a JWA Advisory Board member, Dr. Michael A. Gomez.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I certainly appreciate that introduction by Dr. Achebe, and not quite sure who she was referring to, but I do appreciate it, and I appreciate her invitation to come and address you on this occasion. I want to congratulate her on all of the work that she's done and all that she has accomplished with respect to the journal and other ventures as well. I'm delighted to be back on Michigan State University's campus. I think it's been 20 years or so since I've been here. And so I want to thank all of you for coming. I thank the Almighty for giving me the opportunity to be here. Now, Dr. Achebe, I've changed the title just a bit. And because as I prepared, I began to see things a little differently. And so the title is West African Polity and Society, a Theory of Complementarity, Past and Present. There have been any, well, let me make sure that I don't go over my time. There have been any number of efforts to understand African temporalities. That is, how to differentiate periods in relation to space and movement and developments. Depending upon how far back one goes in relationship to deep history, these efforts often move away from more conventional periodizations for which the European colonial experience serves as principal referent. As a notable example of this effort, Dr. Ogudron divides Yoruba history into 7 moments, his rationale convincing for so doing. In contrast, and for the purposes of this presentation, I employ only 2 new dispensations in order to better capture the imagination and creativity of West African polity. So there is a significant degree of flattening here, and I acknowledge that. In so doing, I place the region into conversation with North Africa and Egypt, an orientation that I concede privileges its Savannah and Sahel, yielding two broad periods that succinctly explain the meta-narrative of the West African Sahel and Savannah. An interior moment, which begins at least with the 8th century CE and extends into the 16th, and a subsequent period from the 16th century to the present. My approach is grounded in the materiality of the West African experience, a set of circumstances deeply informed by the dynamics of trans-regional exchange. As West Africa has been in continuous contact with the Mediterranean for the whole of both periods, my contention has less to do with arguing for the historical accuracy of the model than with exploring its modalities, consequences, and implications. If granted this heuristic accommodation, I would propose that West Africa's anterior moment, in particular its Sahel and Savannah, was characterized by the navigation of both intra and inter-societal balance, whose inaction suggests the existence of complementarity as a widely embraced modus operandi, with balance and complementarity made possible by the embrace of governmental minimalism. The 16th century, in significant contrast, saw the introduction of distortion into this delicate weave of societal politesse. In effect, a serial intervention resulting in disruption and debilitation, all of which led to an ever-expanding, ever-deepening diminution of West African material conditions, becoming one with circumstances otherwise known as an impoverishment. It is often assumed that Africa has always been this way, relatively poor and on the international dole. Indeed, the general impression of the African continent, both popular and scholarly, continues to be one of essentially uninterrupted stasis over millennia, where nothing of note or interest takes place until the transatlantic slave trade and ensuing colonial period. The actual history of West Africa, however, could not be more divergent from Occidental myth. In fact, West Africa was a region in motion, politically, socially, culturally, and perpetually so during the Common Era, if not before. This was particularly true of its western Savannah and Sahel from the 8th through the 16th centuries, where and when. In contrast to prevailing notions of a timeless embryonic Africa, unchanging in its society, in its social and cultural categories and conventions, there unfolded political innovations, as well as the evolution of such mutually constitutive categories as race, slavery, ethnicity, caste, and gendered notions of power. By the period's end, these categories would assume significations not unlike their more contemporary connotations. As indigenous responses to Islam and the trans-Saharan slave trade, these developments serve not only as a corrective to a popularized African past, but also as commentary and interpretations of modernity concerned with the transformation of global markets. Specifically, arguments that the transatlantic slave trade resulted in novel productive capacities, including the industrialization and labor relations, in turn generating new hierarchies of class, race, and gender, are of particular relevance. The reconsideration of West Africa's anterior past is therefore an opportunity to observe the impact of parallel anterior processes. What is more, West Africa from the 13th through the 16th centuries was a region in rapid political ascent, within which the rise of Islam, the growth and influence of the domestically enslaved, and the invention and evolution of empire, all proceeded at an ever-quickening pace. As such, the region would emerge as a burgeoning economic power with imperial ambitions, pursuing and enhancing commercial and diplomatic relations with North Africa and Egypt, vital to all concerned. The first period, from the 8th through the 15th centuries, become visible through poetics, or polyvocal mechanisms by which the themes and concerns of early and medieval West Africa can be discerned. As such, polypoetics attends to the multiple ways in which technologies of memory are both created and deployed in addressing political and social developments, more or less approximating the epistemology we now call history, and in forms that constitute their own aesthetics. The West African iteration of history consists of a blend of methodologies displaying oral and written tableaux that center very different principles, ALS, to tell stories for entirely different audiences and for radically different purposes. As such, polypoetics engage a number of historical traditions that, beginning with the history of ancient Ghana or the ancient Ghanas in the 3rd century of the current era, are in accounts either written from outside of the region or preserved in oral traditions that, given the substantial temporal distance between events and their reconciliation and their recollection, are often metaphorical in form. These early stories give way to subsequent generations of traditions that more concretely describe events, their transmission entrusted to professional casts of griots, of oral historians, and associated praise singers, who mostly preoccupied with the 13th century founder of the Malian Empire, Sunjata, so refined the oral genre that accounts of Sunjata assume the form of a political charter, within which are embedded principles, LES, and relations of governance. Griots will continue as the vehicles through whom the past was articulated with the present, variously assigned to royal families and eminent personalities until the dawn of a new apparatus the domestically written chronicle, entirely novel for the region, an experiment that begins in the 15th century and ends in the 17th, most famously in the form of Abdul Rahman's, Asadi's, Tariq as-Sudan, History of the Blacks, and Mahmoud Khati and Ibn al-Mukhtar's Tariq al-Fatash, History of the Seeker, histories largely concerned with an imperial Songhai of the same period. This shift in the evidentiary base witnessed corresponding changes in objective, as Tariq as-Sudan was composed to protect the interests of religious and commercial elites in Timbuktu under the 17th century Moroccan occupation, while Tariq al-Fatash sought to legitimate the Askia ruling dynasty, arguing for its continuity with antecedent rulers of Imperial Mali and Ghana. Supplemented by external written sources as well as archaeological and epigraphic data, the West African corpus forms a tapestry of documentary evidence. Okay, here we have the El Idrisi's famous 1154 map. And as you can see, it is what some would consider an inverted representation of the globe. Yeah, but this is the way. This is. But you can see the Arabic is written in this, correctly in this way, as opposed to what we're more accustomed to seeing. Largely due to the efforts of archaeologists, we now have a better understanding of developments that precede those covered by griots and chronicles. The West African Sahel was in fact a region of urban settlement long before Mansa Musa in the 14th century. Populations relocating to the Middle Niger, responding to climatic changes from the 10th to the 11th millennia BCE, resulted in the gradual rise of urban culture and society, an example of which was the southwest province of Mimma, where was uncovered an impressive number of clustered late Stone Age hamlets and villages dating to between 3800 and 2200 BCE. From 800 to 400 BCE, the necessary elements of urban civilization become identifiable, followed by the emergence of the first cities from 500 BC to 400 CE. The oral and written sources build upon the archaeological and distillation, maintaining that following Sunjata's 13th century founding of the Malian Empire, a remarkable period of stability and expansion ensued under the legendary Mansa Musa, who was in power from 1312 to 1337. Here you have a representation of the three major polities in West Africa. Here's a more contemporary map locating ourselves, and the famous, yes, this is the famous representation of someone who could have been Sunjata, Mansa Musa, the Majorca map. The oral and written sources build upon the archaeological and distillation, maintaining that following Sunjata's 13th century founding of the Malian Empire, a remarkable period of stability and expansion ensued under the legendary Mansa Musa, in power from 1312 to 1337, ushering in a West Africa at its pinnacle, when Mali becomes a realm of cities through which flowed rivers of commerce, connecting to Mediterranean and Red Sea worlds in an unprecedented continuity of cosmopolitanism. Mansa Musa would embrace Islam emphatically, breaking with predecessors and building mosques in key cities, laying the foundation for Mali's reputation as a Muslim land. Islam would soon become a leading cultural signifier, articulating a realm of growing ethnic diversity while compensating for an imperial presence guided by a minimalist theory of governance. Tales of transoceanic misadventure remained shrouded in uncertainty, but a pilgrimage just as spectacular, whose likes had never been seen, introduced to the world the aspirations of an emerging realm. This dramatic unfolding of West African possibility rested on the empire's unification of the region's three major river systems, the Niger, Senegal, and Gambia, heretofore unrivaled in scope, further facilitating integration into a trans-Saharan trading network of untold value. The 15th century would witness a shift in the political center of gravity. So here we have representation of what I just said, Imperial Mali, and now we're going to move to Songhai, Songre, Songhai. The 15th century would witness a shift in the political center of gravity from Imperial Mali to Songhai, with the rise of the controversial leader Sunni Ali, 1464 to 92, who, inspired by Mali's assimilation of multiple urban centers, first established his capital at the ancient site of Galkukia, and then wrested control over the entire middle Niger Valley, practicing a ruthlessness heretofore unparalleled in the region's history. Sunni Ali, together with a son who immediately succeeds him, would be overthrown by his trusted lieutenant, Muhammad Touré, in league with Timbuktu elites. Muhammad Touré would come to be known as the Skilaj Muhammad and would reign some 36 years from 1493 to 1529. In contrast to Sunni Ali's investment in regional politics, Skilaj Muhammad ushered in a new era of international relations, its dynamics characterized by intellectual vibrancy as well as social transformation. If not quite as territorially expansive or wealthy as Mali under Mansa Musa, Imperial Songhai was nonetheless twice the size of contemporary continental France, and under Skilaj Muhammad represents the height of West African cultural efflorescence and political imagination. Its success, characterized by novel policies of political integration in pursuit of erudition, its pursuit of erudition is unprecedented in West Africa's history, underscoring much that is distinctive about the realm. With its elites' avid embrace of Islam, Songhai became better integrated into the Muslim world, though it would not be afforded sufficient time to realize further advances. The history of early and medieval Savannah and Sahel is therefore of a piece with kings and queens and rulers of the earth consolidating lands and resources. Empires expanded and contracted in response to the vagaries of location in tandem with combinations of creed and greed. The Chinese had long been in imperial formation, transitioning from the Yuan to the Ming dynasties in the 14th century, while Europe was nearing the end of internal transformations that would have global consequences. Bridging the polarities of the old world were the Mongols of the 12th and 13th centuries, with the Golden Horde continuing into the 16th, part of whose vast expansion and fracturing included integration into states and societies, all responding one way or another to the call of Islam. Ethnically, racially, and culturally myriad, a Muslim world whose political unity had long ended, stretched from Iberia to China to Indonesia. Muslim innovation, largely responsible for linking European and Asian lands and all points in between, served as the conduit through which European medieval thought reconnected with that of ancient predecessors, and as the technological basis for Europe's encounter with Mesoamerican Aztecs and Andean Incas. The 14th century was therefore on the cusp of development so far-reaching that within a few hundred years, the collective human condition would be dramatically altered. It is within the initial or early period that a theory of balance and complementarity, both within and between societies, may be of purchase. Such complementarity refers to domains of specialization in which clearly defined communities. So now, there's going to be plenty of exceptions to what I have to say. Okay, so granted, this is a generalization. Such complementarity refers to domains of specialization in which clearly defined communities within and between societies employed widespread approbation and were generally recognized to be responsible for specific forms of productivity upon which the society depended, and in exchange for which other segments engaged in their own distinctive productivities. The dairy products of Fulani pastoralists and those of the Tuareg and their camels were exchanged for the agricultural products of various Mande-speaking communities, as well as fishing communities along the major river systems, all of whom benefited from the activities of endogamous smiths. And although the Mande and Halpuraran and Kiltamashek do not constitute castes, what evidence there is for the early and medieval period suggests they tended to remain within ancestral realms of ancestral spheres of activity, seldom aspiring to, if not disparaging, and totally rejecting the productive domains of other communities. Such expressions of disdain gesture toward those cultural devices that assist in policing the boundaries of productive differentiation, easing tensions by way of prescription and proscription. Productive delineation was further strengthened by ancestral realms of authorization, so that only those in proper relation with disembodied realms had access to the land or to fishing, while those without such ties dared not transgress. This can be seen even in accounts of conquest, with foreign elements moving into new spaces and invariably reaching accommodations with the indigenous and their religious specialists. Strife and conflict erupted on occasion, to be sure, but the logics of complementarity facilitated interdependence among communities throughout the Saharan Savannah, a pattern that resonated elsewhere in West Africa. To the extent that complementarity within societies is consistent with the historical record, its logics also informed interregional relations. For example, there is the transhumance of Fulbe pastoralists, covering many kilometers in search of grazing land, often passing freely through multiple cultural zones and political demarcations. Interregional complementarity is also observed in the organization of long-distance markets, wherein goods traveled through the Sahara and were left in the care of the Tuareg, whereas the transport of resources originating in the savanna and forest areas were the province of the Jula, Maraka, and later Hausa, complementing and supplying local markets. The Jula would convey the goods of the savanna and forest to Sahelian urban markets, where they exchanged them for those of the Saharan and Mediterranean. By means of these long-distance traders, local markets from West Africa to Southern Europe were watered and supplied. All of this is well known. My point is that the logics of complementarity inform production and exchange both within and beyond West Africa. The Tuareg did not seek to replicate the roles of the Jula, nor the Jula those of the Tuareg, as their respective contributions were integrated into a delicate balance of economic and cultural interaction. We can discern some of the origins of these relations in the Sunjata epic. Traditions meant not only as rendition, but also as contemplation, valorizing developments while providing a vision for what is normative in society, culture, and politics. Their prescriptive function helps explain the divergence, comprising the terrain on which subsequent contestation has been waged and retroactively applied. As such, prescriptive traditions featuring creative acts help us to understand their contexts, examples of which include the ancestral lines of the griots, the principal Marabutic families, the relationship of the Tuaregs to the Camaras and Kaitas, and so forth. But this prescriptive tier may also contain an unintended interlineality between certain creative acts. For although performed and recorded for didactic purposes, these acts arguably reveal something of actual historical import. This is particularly true of the Smiths, a formation through which Mande society can be observed in historical process. In presenting the Sunjata-Sumaru conflict as an allegorical reflection of tensions between Smiths and a rising mercantile community allied with warriors, and thus economic and technological transition in the 13th century Savannah Sahel, scholars have already made the point that these accounts reveal something about evolving relations. Generally speaking, Mali's rise was predicated on Sahelian commercial expansion deep into the savannah, driven by slaving and the discovery of a new source of gold at Bure. Further consideration of the Smiths, however, leads to another hypothesis, that the era of Sunjata was one in which social relations were in negotiation. Sumaru may have been a Smith, excuse me, but so was Fakoli Koroma, one of Sunjata's principal companions, and so was Frankamara. And both Fakoli and Frankamara become indispensable to Sunjata as generals and governors. In this way, rather than conflict between social strata, war between Sunjata and Sumaru is more emblematic of open-ended processes. In subsequently prescribing what is normative, therefore, oralists may actually reveal social relations in formation as historical developments. The story of Sumaru is particularly instructive. Emerging from a servile status and referred to as the slave of Da, apparently the ruler of Ga or Wagadu. His Kante lineage was the product of the servile estate in Wagadu, where, for the end of the Sise dynasty, privileged slaves established their own authority. Sumaru rises as a powerful, independent ruler of the Susu, as well as the son of a leading blacksmith. But he is both, without obvious contradiction. Sumaru's story, therefore, reflects the absence of barriers to smiths, with Mande's social segmentation unfolding as a dynamic process. Though there would be a waning in the late 14th century, in its heyday, Imperial Mali achieved unprecedented success, displaying genius in bringing together powerful political and cultural currents in a mutually complementary fashion. Politically, the state built upon local and regional forms of governance, folding them into a more capacious and broader configuration of hierarchical power. The formula of integrating the local into the regional, in turn, provided a grid across which political authority was extended over a territorial expanse that never before witnessed in West Africa, uniting once again the Niger and the Senegal and the Gambia under a single centralized power. The achievement of such vast dominion resulted in control over multiple trading routes, entrepôts, and mining centers directly and indirectly, and an accumulation of wealth possibly unrivaled anywhere in the world at that time, certainly far beyond anything ever witnessed in West Africa. The kingdom's political and economic pillars were in turn strengthened by a cultural approach embracing Islam's universality while eschewing its forceful imposition. This posture enshrined mutual respect between practitioners of Islam and ancestral religions, while laying the foundation for an efflorescence of urban Islamic culture and learning in the decades and centuries to follow. A diverse Islam, Mande political cultural innovation, and Jula commercial indispensability connected the far-flung reaches of a realm that would assume iconic proportions, arguably West Africa's greatest. Key to Mali's remarkable success, therefore, as well as that of Imperial Songhai in the 15th and 16th centuries, was the embrace of minimalism as a method of governance, an approach whereby local communities were largely allowed to pursue their lives and interests. To be sure, my view of minimalism is in tension with the notion of Mali, and Songhai as, quote, composite monarchies, featuring a weak center that facilitates yet depends upon autonomous provinces, and whose authority also derives from association with cognate cultural centers. In the model of composite monarchies, secular and cultural, often religious authority is mutually reinforcing, benefiting from symbolic or ritual rather than coercive power. According to this view, medieval West African societies were organized by dispersed sources of authority that, when effective, worked in concert. Though appealing, the composite monarchy's symbolic authority conceptualization is heavily dependent upon the anthropological and archaeological literature, and casts the widest of nets by which information is culled from societies throughout Africa from all periods, from ancient Nubia to colonial Congo. The most panoptic of approaches, both spatially and temporally. Contemporary sources for medieval West Africa are rendered subsidiary to a thickly described multidisciplinary analysis and are discounted as revisionist in light of their political agendas. I arrive at a different conclusion, that relations of power as described in the sources reflect actual conditions of the period and are far too detailed and imbricated to reflect ideological fabrication from whole cloth. Furthermore, there are plenty of examples of coercive power in medieval West Africa, from tribute to multiple forms of taxation to military conscription, all flowing from a political center. The fact that the state would ally with either Muslim or ancestral religious officials to augment or extend its power is hardly unique to West Africa, or Africa as a whole for that matter. And in the case of Imperial Songhai, the state was in substantial conflict with a substantial component of Islam's religious estate for virtually the whole of its history, demonstrating the targeted nature of its coercive efforts. In light of the foregoing, it is more accurate to view the political center's articulation with province and periphery as a conscious decision a philosophy of governance as opposed to enfeebled capacity. But it was a minimalist approach that, while arguably informed by the challenges of distance and infrastructure, at least as equally, if not more so, reveals a privileging of relative degrees of autonomy radiating from the center, a resolution that honored cultural sensibilities while preserving, to the extent possible, long-standing intercommunal protocols. Stated differently, minimalism was a philosophy of governance in support of balance and complementarity, yet allowing for change and evolution. A perfect example of the foregoing is Imperial Songhai and the Diaspora, which witnessed a return of a cosmopolitanism absent from the region since Mansa Musa, like the Malian achievement more than 100 years earlier. Songhai's internationalism would emphasize cities nurtured and sustained by ongoing transregional commerce, combined with social experimentation and the privileging of Islamic cultural practice, all while embracing a political minimalism respecting balance and complementarity. With this sense of heightened West African urbanity, while this sense of heightened West African urbanity is certainly a function of the source's focus, it yet qualifies as distinctive for place and period. I use the term Renaissance to characterize the reign of Eskil Muhammad, again, 1493 to 1529, not only for the manner in which urbanity was emphasized and supported by state policies, but also by reconnections with polities and luminaries in the central Islamic lands. The restoration of ties regaled as indispensable insignia under Mansa Musa once again become emblematic of the state under Muhammad Touré, and as such constitutes a dramatic rejection of the policies of his predecessor, Sunni Ali. Indeed, it is striking that virtually nothing is recorded of foreign diplomacy under Sunni Ali. In contrast, Eskil Muhammad inaugurates a new era of international relations, reinvigorating ties with the centers of the Muslim world. Eskil Muhammad would reign some 36 years longer than Sunjata, Mansa Musa, Sunni Ali. Originally affixed to clerical and commercial interests, the Eskil's arrogation of power would encourage a review of those relations, leading to a series of challenges to Timbuktu and Guinea's self-promotion as bastions of autonomy and self-regulation. The Eskil's policies are therefore not unlike those of Mansa Musa, who paired internationalism with indigenization. Notwithstanding certain challenges, Songhai's cosmopolitanism reached a height of sophistication never before witnessed in the region. More specifically, it is with Songhai that a variety of communities, Songhai Halpolar and Mande speakers, Keltamashek, etc., undergo a process through which their allegiance to the state begins to supersede group loyalties, resulting in a new formation, in the formation of a new political identity, as opposed to the Soninke of the Ghanas or Mande-centered Mali, whose peripheral inclusion of others, such as the Wolof and Fulbe along the Senegal or the Songhai in the eastern Niger Bucco, did not affect its political core. Songhai represents a novel political project that reified the state while seeking the full incorporation of its constitutive parts. As an experiment in West African pluralism, it is unprecedented. Like Mansa Musa, Eskil Muhammad would embark upon a campaign of significant territorial expansion, extending well into the northern Sahel. With the Niger Bucco having been secured under Sunni Ali, the Eskil pursued a northward projection to realize a greater share of trans-Saharan commerce. At its height, the realm would cover more than 1.4 million square kilometers. Its principal urban centers of Gao, Timbuktu, and Guinea, boasting populations of as many as 100,000, 80,000, and 40,000 respectively. Notwithstanding such accomplishments, Songhai would slowly be circumscribed by breathtaking transformations on a global scale. The dawn of a new dispensation, ushering in a period of distortion, of fitna, of serial disruption, undermining the intricacies, dynamism, and viability of West Africa's system of balance, complementarity, and minimalism, creating the predicate for the region's eventual impoverishment. In foregrounding the materiality of the West African experience, there is little mystery concerning what unfolds during the subsequent period of distortion and disruption. Songhai's fall to the Moroccans in 1591 represents the end of West African sovereignty in the northern regions of West Africa. This was a spectacular demise, ending nearly a millennium of West African rule from the forest in the south to the sand of shore of the Sahel. This was a spectacular demise, ending nearly a millennium of West African rule from the forest in the south to the shore of sand, the Sahel in the north. This abrupt end to sovereignty in the north comports perfectly with a much slower, but arguably far more deadly development to the south, along West Africa's coastal watery shores. For it was at the end of the 16th century that the West African littoral, from Senegambia to the Bights of Benin and Biafra, saw the transatlantic trafficking in human beings enter a new phase relative to what would transpire. What was a trickle, with over 13,000 Africans trafficked by 1521, became a flood. 100 years later, when nearly 353,000 were exported, a 27-fold exponential increase. As such, it is with the end of the 16th century, coinciding with Songhai's defeat, that human trafficking into the Americas became both substantial and irreversible, transitioning the continent into the deepest of naders, a veritable age of catastrophe. The global African experience in the 21st century is an afterlife. To be sure, trafficking through the Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean antedates their Atlantic counterpart. But when the 4 million Africans estimated to have been transported in roughly the same period are combined with the 12.5 million estimated for the Atlantic trade, the consequential impact of the removal of nearly 17 million people in such a telescope period, less than 400 years, on the region comes into better relief. And then came, at the transatlantic's conclusion, European colonialism. I openly acknowledge what is implicit here, that the histories of Africa and this diaspora are inextricably interwoven, even unintelligible, if not conjoined. As but one example, the British would outlaw slaving in the Atlantic Ocean in 1807-08, even going so far as to use its navy to interdict the individual slave individual slave vessels and return captives to places like Sierra Leone. Britain would end slavery in the Caribbean, in its Caribbean colonies, 1834-38. Only later, in that very same century, embark upon a breathtaking expansion of imperial power in Africa itself, initiating a colonial longue durée matched only by the French. Much of Europe would fully embrace imperial expansion in Africa as well as Asia, animated by a thirst for resources and the need for markets, first whet by its earliest ventures in the Americas. Notions of missionizing and spreading civilization, quote unquote, may have motivated some, but in the larger scheme of things were but the thinnest of veneers for economic enterprise and domination. When studied in tandem as opposed to separately, human trafficking and colonial rule in Africa are revealed to be components of like processes. Cane and coffee and cotton production in the Americas yielded tremendous profits for which the demand for labor was voracious. Importation of various textiles and other products into West Africa incentivized but preceded apace with the import of firearms and the region's militarization. Tensions correspondingly heightened within and between communities. Hostilities scaled up, and communities once in balance became enemies. Serial wars ensued between Oyo and Dahomey, between Asante and the Fante Confederacy, et cetera, while the Aro intensified their exactions on related Igbo communities. The tentacles of the trades would reach far into the interior, affecting aspiring theocracies like the Omamids of Futa Jallo in the 1720s, Futa Toro in the 1760s, the Sokoto Caliphate in the early 19th century. That in following the late 17th century models of the Tubanan and Shulbuba movements along the Middle Senegal and Bundu's establishment in the Upper Senegal, also participated in millenarian discourse circulating through the Dar al-Islam. Their raison d'etre may well have initially been the protection of Muslims from slaving, but in the process, they became implicated in slaving themselves, as the example of Athar Rahman, you talked about this already, of elite birth in Futa Jallo, but who wound up on a Mississippi plantation after being captured while raiding, vividly illustrates. The militarization of the region in pursuit of slaving unraveled the fabric of balance and minimalism that had characterized West African political economy for centuries. The framework of social relations underwent a fundamental shift, a veritable transformation from complementarity to exploitation. We will never know how the village democracies of the Igbo, the city-states of the Hausa and Yorubas, or the kingdoms of the Wolof might have continued to unfold had they been left to their own devices. For what Europe dismantled, it remade in its own image, in instances preceding and then following the 1884-85 Berlin Conference. Africa and Asia's era of independence, spanning from the 1940s through the 1970s, with the fall of Portuguese rule in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique, and culminating in the demise of apartheid in South Africa in 1994, has resulted in certain gains and the emergence of political classes, but it is evident that much of Africa has yet to exit from the economic influence, if not control, of former colonial authorities. Experimentation with Marxist-inflected economic programs in various countries yielded far from positive results, and in a number of instances were abject failures. While with the rise of OPEC oil prices in the 1970s, further setting back many African economies from which they never recovered. The structural adjustment programs of the IMF and World Bank since the 1990s have arguably proven to be just as injurious, with their emphasis on the free market, resulting in significantly diminished investment in human potential. This does not portend well for a continent where, according to a recent report in the New York Times, the population will reach 2.5 billion by 2050, when 1 out of every 4 persons on the planet will be African born. The response to ongoing, seemingly intractable challenges has been a boisterous groundswell, and insistence on that West Africa pursue true quote unquote sovereignty, by which is meant attending to the materiality of African life, such that its resources and productivity benefit the people rather than a few elites, foreign governments, and multinational corporations. A first step in this process has been the expulsion of the foreign military presence, particularly and especially the French, from officers who seized power in Mali, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, to duly elected officials in Senegal. All call for sovereignty. But of course, the major question is the same as the principal obstacle to its answer. How is sovereignty to be achieved? As neither an economist nor a political scientist, nor having spent the night at a Holiday Inn Express, I cannot answer this question as they would, nor should I, as Africa has no lack of experts in these areas, offering a plethora of wonderful recommendations. How then might the historian answer this question, offering a usable history in response to presentist concerns? My own response begins with recognizing the path already pioneered by Boubacar Bari, who in the 1998 English translation of his Senegambia and the Atlantic slave trade offers history both as context and rationale to buttress his advocacy of regional integration. In building upon this foundation, I would mention 3 moments in medieval West African history from which contemporary stakeholders might learn. The first concerns Imperial Mali at its height. The second concerns the record of Imperial Songhai's demise in the late 16th century, while the third returns to an earlier period in Imperial Songhai's history. A meditation on 14th century Imperial Mali under Mansa Musa is in essence a call to a return to an African-generated political imagination. Long before the colonial onslaught, African polities ranged from autonomous villages to city-states to kingdoms to empires, often adjacently situated, often living in relative peace. These societies were free to organize themselves and determine processes of access to power and privilege as they saw fit. Given the successful global imposition of Westphalian order, there is little practicality in attempting to emulate specific pre-colonial models, but the larger point remains. Africans must reimagine their world rather than continue an arguably quixotic struggle to adapt and make work concepts unique to Europe's political evolution. Neither is it evident that the initiatives currently contested in the Central Islamic lands are any more appropriate. In revisiting Imperial Mali, the principal lesson may well be its regional character, that is, the issue of scale. Again, referencing Bari, this suggests the need to reconstruct the West African political order, creating a federation of some sort, a federal power that transcends the colonial legacy of linguistic cultural delineation, uniting the whole of West Africa. Minimalist federation that allows for local autonomy while equally distributing resources and revenue. That's the key. Can only benefit the region. To be sure, ECOWAS and CEDEAO gestures toward this, but it appears to lack capacity. And France, in particular, has evinced fear of any move toward federation, witness its opposition to the creation of a region-wide single currency. But it remains West Africa's responsibility, not France's, China's, or Russia's, to address the issue of materiality, as economic independence remains the fundamental issue. This is the fundamental issue. The expansion of South-South commercial relations in combination with such efforts as the realization of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement are certainly steps in the right direction, but they will need to work in concert with serious investment in human development and productive capacity. Critical to the foregoing, therefore, is leadership and vision, for which late 16th century serves as a cautionary tale, as it was a period in which successors, so immersed with internecine power struggles, became wholly oblivious to shifting internal dynamics as well as Morocco's growing threat. Consumed with self-interest, Songhai's autocratic leadership led to catastrophe and the state's utter ruin, a model of what not to do. To be clear, West Africa's current political class is no more corrupt than counterparts elsewhere. But a major difference between West Africa and the US, for example, is that the size of the latter's economy helps it to better absorb shocks and graft. With that understood, leadership must reflect skill and integrity and be committed to democratic processes that render government, constrained by checks and balances, accountable to the people. But here, I admit, I'm at a loss for from what sector of civil society shall such leadership emerge? The third moment under consideration, I'm coming to a conclusion, returns to the early ascendant period of Imperial Songhai under Skilaj Muhammad. Highly generative for our purposes in at least three ways. To begin, these decades represent the height of Songhai's cultural efflorescence, replicating the level of investment in learning and scholarly endeavor pioneered 150 years earlier by Mansa Musa. It was under Skilaj Muhammad that Timbuktu and Guinea became iconic expressions of West African cultural genius, attracting students and scholars from across the Muslim world and serving as examples of African possibility, the outcome of political imagination matching economic sovereignty. Mention of Songhai cultural productivity segues to its gender dynamics. Long before the 16th century, women had wielded political authority at various levels and in combination with their full integration into multiple registers of economic life. The subsequent regendering of power relations accompanied adoption of aspects of alternative models from beyond the region. But careful analysis of the sources reveals that under Askia Muhammad, women made critical contributions to Songhai's cultural life and political imagination. His example would be emulated centuries later with an emphasis on women's education under Usman Dan Fodio and Sukutu. These examples serve to encourage initiatives and investments that allow for the full and vigorous participation of women in all aspects of West African society. This third moment's final component also draws from the cosmopolitanism of Skilaj Muhammad's Songhai. Then and there, in response to regional and trans-regional challenges, a new political identity was formed, one that recognized loyalties to locale and ethnicity, yet called for their transcendence by way of an imperial membership. In similar but elevated fashion, we are challenged to rethink context as both local and global. The African, whether born in the continent or outside of it, must reconsider shared transatlantic histories that commend shared solutions. We must do the work of expanding the intersections of community. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to Professor Michael Gomez for such a wonderful presentation. I think that we'll now open the floor for questions. For the next couple of minutes, if you have any questions about the talk, please put your hand up and then we will go through some of the questions. So, any questions?
Wonderful, I can sit down.
I'll ask one. I'm interested in. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm Mark Dietz. I'm an assistant professor of African and World History at the American University in Cairo, and I'm interested in some of the alternative political imaginations that, like Frederick Cooper and Gary Wilder, have written about in French West Africa. You were kind of talking about this, about sort of recovering some of the history and tradition of these three great Islamic empires in West Africa that you've written so much about and talked about today. Where is the resistance to like a stronger West African federation? Where does the resistance come from? Is it coming from the states? Is it coming from forces of global capitalism? Where do you see that? What are the obstacles? What are the impediments?
Yeah. So once again, I'm neither an economist nor a political scientist. So I want to qualify my response before moving forward. As I understand the situation, there was significant momentum toward moving toward a unitary currency in the region that transcended, a kind of Anglophone Francophone divide. And as I further understand things, France put a lot of pressure on the region to kill that initiative. Presumably there was a fear of Nigeria's role in this, but there was certainly the concern that France's influence, would be diminished as a consequence of this unitary currency. So my understanding is, and I'm sure that there's probably sectors within West Africa that are also opposed to this or had some misgivings about it. But I think that to some extent, maybe to a large extent, France's position and ability to influence the region resulted in this situation. Now, I don't know where things are now. The last thing I heard is that, so as you know, Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso pulled out of CEDEAO. So, and there's been a movement to move away from the CFA. But my understanding is that this is still this conversation is still kind of circulating, and Professors Davignon and Cham know more about this than I. But my understanding is that to the extent that there's a discussion of a kind of unified currency, it's circulating among French, formerly French-controlled territories. So that whole, So apparently it's a very difficult situation. it's a very difficult challenge. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you came in a little late, just to remind everybody, the lunchroom is right over there. You can pick up your lunch if you need to. There's a hand up over here for a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Nana. I agree with everything you're saying. And you mentioned earlier in the talk that you were not concerned by historical accuracy per se, but with the models that they bring. And I haven't read the book yet, but I was speaking to Bruce Hall about Manu Nobly. I'm mispronouncing the name, I think.
His name.
His book, I guess, critiquing the historical accuracy of Askia Muhammad, who you bring up a lot. And so I was wondering what your retort might be to if there is a historical inaccuracy, in quotes. Again, I read the book to look at the sources he's citing, but yeah, how do you respond to that in going back and then forward again to the model you're creating? Yeah.
Controversy. Professor Nobley, who I think is at Illinois, a wonderful scholar, and his So basically what the differences that we have basically concern how to understand this one text, Tariq al-Fatash. Who wrote it? When was it written? Wakala. And Nobody's position is that we should understand Tariq al-Fatash as being the invention of this guy, Amadou Lobo, who will come to rule Masina from Hamdullahi. And so we disagree. And I think that there is evidence to suggest that at least some core of Tariq al-Fatash was written by the scholar named Mahmoud Khati, who lived during the time of Skia Dawood in Imperial Songhai. So we disagree. But it doesn't affect the accuracy of my analysis, nor does it necessarily impact his scholarship. But we'll see how that works out. We'll see how that works out. Yeah.
Dave?
Basically, what's happened is that so you had these three texts, these three forms of Tariq al-Fatash. They were around for a long time, and subsequently there are other editions, if you will, or copies of Tariq al-Fatash have come to light. And so people are working with these other copies to see what's different and so forth and so on. And my position is that, there may be a few differences, but those differences are minor. It doesn't affect the overall trajectory of the analysis. So he's a wonderful scholar.
First of all, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk and tracing this genealogy of politics and complementarity. I feel like my head is spinning in all the best ways. So my name is Dave Glovsky. I'm also a historian of sort of Greater Senegambia, the Sahel area. And one question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, you talk about this political theory of minimalism, and I mean, it totally makes sense to me. I think moving this past the idea of state weakness and really to show this minimalism as a strength, I think is incredibly valuable. And what I'm curious is, how did this minimalism shape sort of broader society across the region in terms of sociocultural life, in terms of economics? Like, what sort of remnants can you see historically and also in the present of these traditions in the ways that they have like shaped societies across the region? And what might that offer us going forward for sort of more of a like social vision of West Africa rather than just a political vision?
Yeah, that's a very, if we take a look at so it's with the Imperial Songhai that we can really drill down and see, okay, what's happening with Gao? What is Gao's relationship with Timbuktu? What is its relationship with Jinni? What is its relationship with Dindi in the south? What is its relationship to the Azawad to the north? What's going on? And so there we see evidence of an approach, okay, whereby Songhai engages at the local level, okay, when it absolutely must, but otherwise it allows these localities, these provinces to live their lives. So we see, for example, okay, so that it's my argument that Gao was absolutely invested in Timbuktu in particular, but Jinni as commercial centers, and was very much interested in reaping as much benefit from these centers as absolutely possible. And so what we find as we look at the sources, okay, is this repeated discussion of what we know to be Marxism, Mukus, non-Sharia taxation, illegal taxation, and so forth. And so you see in the sources a repeated focus, or coming back to talking about how Gao is continually trying to extract. It's a very extractive process, to which, against which the religious estate in Timbuktu reacts and resists. But you see that also the architecture, the military and political architecture that Gao put in place in and around Timbuktu is very impressive. And so you don't see that kind of focus in other parts of the Songhai Empire. So what I'm saying is that, but yet you had apparently a loyalty to the state. The state could draw upon, well, for a period it could draw upon resources, right, outside of these urban areas when needed. There does seem to be a movement. It becomes very, very visible middle of the 16th century under Askar Dawood. There does seem to be a movement to more and more of a reliance on enslaved labor. In fact, under Dawood, we see the evidence for plantations. Very, very similar to what you will see develop in Sao Tome, Principe, Madeira, and the Americas in full bloom in Songhai. So, yeah, so that's something about which we need to learn a bit more. Not quite sure how we will learn it. So I'm saying that there's evidence that the central power intervenes to the extent and went into the extent that it needs to for the purposes of pursuing its interests. With that said, we don't quite know how the state. So we know that the state imposed non-Sharia taxation on these urban areas. We don't quite know to what extent it regulated markets. That would be the really interesting thing. To what extent is it involved in the interaction between the Tuareg and the Jula? To what extent does it get involved in the business of the Jula? And you have to be very careful with that, right? Because these networks are critical to your. So right. So as evidence of this, just as kind of anecdotal, but right, Mansa Musa is in Cairo. Musa said a lot of things in Cairo that are not repeated elsewhere. No evidence for it elsewhere. But anyway, he says, they ask him about the gold, about extracting gold and so forth. And he's asked, well, what he says, well, you know, they kind of have a partnership with people who actually do the gold mining. So he's asked, well, why don't you just go ahead and take over these mines? And he says, well, you know, if you do that, then the mining dries up. This is an example of the minimalism I'm talking about. They created a partnership, yeah, and that also has to do, as Dr. Davignon knows well, it also has to do, yeah, with the issue of religion and so forth. As Muslims, they probably couldn't go into that area. I know that things have changed more recently, but historically, this is a matter of what community has relationship with the unseen powers that oversee that particular activity. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
So
Gomez.
your question was, yeah, it's far-reaching.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for your address. When I was listening to your presentation, I had a lot of questions and I was making notes for a connected research I'm conducting right now. So I am, my question is more reflective, you know. Oh, please, my name is Bright Alozie, Assistant Professor of Black Studies at Portland State University. So my question is more reflective. You know, I was thinking about, you know, when we talk about West African polity, you know, political systems and all of that, there's a lot of talk about the integrity of West African political institutions. And considering the fact that you are approaching what historians call, your study through what historians call the long durée of history, you know, from the 18th century up to colonialism. So I'm wondering, how do you approach this integrity in West African political systems? You know, does it reflect some that kind of commitment to social justice, transparency, accountability that differs from Western political systems, or does it overlap with kind of broader ethical considerations and governance? You know, and then secondly, how do we as scholars, or how do you as the scholar doing this research, avoid reducing West African political ideologies and political histories to categories that strictly align with Western political thought, like democracy, monarchy, or the state? Yeah. So yeah, you know, is that kind of distinctiveness even possible?
So, yeah, I think so. These are very good questions. I don't know that I have, you know, really good answers for them. You know, with respect to questions of integrity in the political process as it applies to a medieval state, I guess the question at that point is, to what extent does the state live up to its avowed values and principles? In the case of, not so much in the case of Mali, but certainly in the case of Songhai, the question always was, to what extent is this, the issue was, to what extent does the Esquiate strive to and aspire to become a truly Muslim polity, a true Muslim state? To what extent is it really governed by Islamic law? And you know, I think that's the ethical question in that context. Okay, I can answer that question, but to move on to so I don't know that the question of integrity during this early period really emerges in these other kinds of categories that you raised. Now, when we get to the subsequent period, or your second question, this is a really interesting question, and it traverses all kinds of categories. So, for example, with respect to slavery, we had a long conversation and debate in the historiography as to how do we understand "quote unquote" domestic slavery in Africa. Did it exist? How did it exist? Is it the same thing as we see in the West? Is it the same? And so you've had these kinds of, and so there are those who have proceeded from the position that that there is a phenomenon known as slavery that is transcultural, transregional, that escapes, you know, all of these different zones, that becomes visible, you know, under multiple lenses. And the question is to identify a definition that captures all of these different dimensions. That has been, you know, a challenge, as opposed to other scholars who, going back to was it Myers and Kopitov, who did the edited version of African slavery, who were basically making the argument that, you know, when it comes to domestic slavery in Africa, it's a different thing, and it has to be understood on its own, in its own terms. And so I do think that maybe with respect to gender, right, you have that kind of controversy, you know, unfolding as we speak. is there a thing known that we can call feminism that operates within African circles, that operates within Muslim societies and so forth and so on? Is this a Western kind of borrowing, approbation, what is the, sorry, appropriation is what I was going to say. Yeah. So this is something that this kind of thing, that Africa is unique and different to the extent that it has to be understood, very differently from other parts of the world. This is something that is present in the scholarship. I don't know that I agree with that, but whether we agree or disagree, the question is, whatever your position is on it, the challenge becomes, how do you visualize the phenomenon? How do you make sense of the phenomenon such that people in multiple communities and cultural circumstances can understand what you're talking about? It's a challenge.
All right. Well, maybe we would have one last question from Professor Gundimu. Yeah.
I was thinking of your theory of minimalism and federalism of the reconstructed West African state, and the possibilities in there. And I was wondering if you had thought of looking beyond the Islamic models from history and looked at the proximate West African cultures, traditional cultures that were not Islamic at that time, that had in operation some forms of governments where they had powerful rulers in some cases, but where there was great deal of minimalism and autonomy at the household level, the family level, that had quite independent authority in governance, and still had a relationship with the ruling obas or emirs or chiefs and so on and so forth, but had zones of authority that were complementary with that of the powerful ruler. And also whether it's even possible to reconstruct a federal West African state from those bases or merging it with the Islamic examples, when we have had the influence of these monotheistic religions, Islam and Christianity, on African societies that have completely destroyed these societies in terms of their imagination and what's possible. Thank you.
Excellent question. And so my earlier intention was to, in fact, try to capture both Muslim and non-Muslim anterior models. I thought it wise to not do that because those are not, Islam is my research area, and these other areas are not. And realizing that I'd be speaking amongst experts, I thought it better not to go into those areas. But I absolutely agree with you. Now, what this does is it alludes to, it gestures toward, this is fascinating, complicated, but it has so much potential. Yeah, that's why I'm calling for a reimagination of this, because sure, there were difficulties, conflicts, contretemps, so forth, so on, earlier, prior to the colonial period, prior to conquest and so forth, but it would appear that that experience was far less than what takes place subsequently, especially as we, now that we're seeing what's happening in the continent today. That is to say that whether societies were Muslim or non-Muslim, Christian, wakala, there was something that seemed that African societies, especially adjacent, seemed to, a sense of complementarity that these societies seem to participate in, agree with, and it explained how they were able to engage with one another. I am just fascinated by this, and I want to, maybe some of you can email me or something, because I really want you to push back on this issue of complementarity, because as I think about it more and more, it explains so much about the interior mechanisms of West Africa, and also trying to what would be considered to be antithetical to those interests. Universality is a problem, and so obviously monotheism of various stripes brings with it the notion of universality. So then it becomes interesting. What do these West African societies do with this claim? And invariably, the response is a West African response, okay, that seeks to continue to subscribe to and embrace and recognize and honor these earlier concepts, features, values of complementarity. What happens but what happens as a consequence of that? So when we get to the 18th, 19th centuries, for example, West Africa and the Sahel and Savannah, what happens? Essentially, what happens is that this whole business of the age of jihad, where you have holy war break out across the expanse from the Atlantic to Lake Chad, and then the consequences of that shift further east all the way over to what is now Sudan. What is that about? That is about a claim to universality, which says, "Oh, you Africans, you're not doing this right, okay, and this needs to be corrected." And so now the region is experiencing yet another iteration of that, beginning in 2013 with what happens in northern Mali. People come down into Timbuktu and so forth to say, this what you're practicing, this is not Islam. All right, so for the Salafis in the room, there are Salafis and then there are Salafis, and so I understand that, but it's a reading of the universality, and West Africa has a long tradition, history, tendency to resist that, or to put it into conversation with what exists before, to try to make sense of it, to make it work, for that region. I want to say something else before I sit down, and that is, I'm sorry, the professor's second part of the question, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it. It seemed like it was very important, but I do want to say before I take my seat. Professor Chebbi has long championed the whole business of global Africa, and I subscribe to that. And I am convinced that the way forward is to articulate these various communities, because there's so much potential there. The experiences are parallel. They're not necessarily the same, but they are parallel, such that they render all of these different African descendant communities basically in the same situation. And so I want to encourage us to think about it. And I'd be very interested in working with anyone who's interested in moving that conversation forward. At this point in my career, at this point in my life, I'm interested in solutions. Yeah, I'm interested in moving from the theoretical to what can we implement. Yeah, and so I'm interested. But I'll also be interested to hear what your response to the question I put forward. Because I'm saying I'm really at a loss as to what formation from the civil society this leadership is going to come from, because as the fourth estate, as journalists become enmeshed in misinformation and sources of information, as academics become enamored with celebrity, I don't know. And, but it has to come from someplace. So I think my time is done, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.